Armenian defenders and survivors of Cilicia left their ancient homeland, never to return. Behind them remained ruined cities, torn down homes, churches and public buildings, and a few stranded old people. The aftermath of the genocide was everywhere. Many Armenian women and girls had been abducted by Turks as slaves and concubines. The genocide of 1915 destroyed more than half of the Armenian people living under Turkish domination. Forced deportation routes led the Armenians to the Syrian desert, to the city of Aleppo. The Arabs, who also had suffered under Turkish rule, welcomed the Armenians in their midst. At that time, Syria was a distant outpost of the Ottoman Empire, populated by Arabs who wanted independence. Following the war, Syria was freed from Turkey and came under French mandatory rule. Aleppo, the major city of northern Syria, became the gathering place for destitute, homeless Armenians who had survived the massacres and the deportations. Within sight of the ancient fortress of Aleppo, the Armenians were to find a new home. Beginning in 1916, a remnant of a people arrived in Aleppo. Only a handful of people from the once prosperous kingdom of Cilicia, no more than 20,000, faced an uncertain future. Gathered in small groups, they stood on the edge of a strange Arab town, full of bitter memories of forefathers always driven out of a homeland. Yet their first thought was to affirm their Christian faith by building houses of worship. Out of this wretched group, living in slums and caves, the spirit of a once great and glorious kingdom was to be resurrected. During their moment of greatest anguish, they did not know or ever dream how far they would rise. The American and European missionaries had been active in Cilicia for several decades. The missionaries had disapproved of establishing an Armenian political existence. After the genocide, they were careful not to offend Turks by championing Armenian calls for justice, although they remained generous in their relief programs. Armenian organizations and all-line Armenian families of Aleppo also helped their destitute compatriots. Together with American and French relief groups, they set up bread lines and soup kitchens. And destitute survivors from Cilicia and from other parts of historical Armenia settled into slums as squatters on land they did not own. A new life was started, at last, without fear of massacre. Conditions in the slums were dangerous and unsanitary. Disease was rampant. Children's mortality rate was high. Tuberculosis and trachoma were common. Vandalism and alcoholism were widespread. They tried to maintain an ethnic identity by seeking to live together with others from the same town in the homeland. There was a Marash camp, an Orfa camp. The survivors of Zeytun, Aintab, Erzurum, Harapurt, Gürün, and Kilis dwell in other sections of the shantytown. Always, there was the search for lost ones. Abducted girls and women were rescued from Turkish harems. Orphans were found in the desert. A people scattered, as if by a violent storm, were being gathered. Despair engulfed particularly the children and youth, but feelings of freedom and nationalism dominated their thoughts. A European missionary observed that the youth had become anxious to learn about their national history. She said, "They listen with great attention to those who talk of revenge. They have talent, but do not know what direction to go." In the ancient homeland, education had always been an important part of traditional Armenian life. Now, bed sheets separated the makeshift classrooms. The traditional apprenticeship system had broken down during the massacres and deportations. Now, they started to refashion life by reviving old skills and talents in carpentry, needlework, weaving. Conditions were crowded. Several families often lived together in a single room. Nursery schools were set up by volunteer groups. Slowly, families were reunited, with each passing month. Better housing, more food, better clothing, and leisure time were available. By 1925, there were almost 40,000 Armenian refugees in Aleppo. Half of them were living in the camps. In the rest of Syria, there were about another 100,000 Armenians. Among them were many widows whose husbands had perished during the genocide. They were learning new trades and taking leadership roles in the community. The cost of living was escalating due to the general adverse economic climate of Syria. Most refugees were unemployed, so the Armenians started to build their own cottage industries. In the mid-1920s, almost 40% of the Armenian labor force was occupied with needlework and rug weaving. By the late 1920s, the Armenians had been squatters in the slums for over 6 years. They had built homes and factories. The landlords were clamoring to move them out and get back their properties. In 1945, the Syrian courts gave the Armenian squatters 1 year to destroy the slums, their homes, and places of work. It was a desperate situation for the Armenians. A fervor gripped the community. A group of city Armenians came together to purchase land for the refugees. Volunteer cooperatives were formed for resettlement. Lumber was parceled out. Old shacks were torn down.